get started here. All right. Hello and welcome to the Montana Office of Public Instruction, Indian Education for All's final in our webinar series, Unpacking the Essential Understandings Regarding Montana Indians. My name is Jennifer Statham, and I am an Indian Education for All specialist. We are so glad that you have joined us this evening. We have an incredible presentation on sovereignty tonight in store for you. We are recording this meeting for future use, so all will be on mute except the speakers, and only the current speaker will appear on your screen. Please choose the chat feature throughout the presentation. Also in the chat, as soon as I'm done with the introduction, will be important links for renewal units and resources, including a link for the Google Drive folder where all of the resources that are spoken about in all of the webinars, including the Deeper Dive series, can be found. The sign in and post webinar survey, the post webinar survey will only be available for 24 hours. So please make sure that you do that right away, and I will put the link in the chat. It is also on your reminder letter. So with that, let me get into the history of the essential understandings and why they're so important. They came about several years ago after Indian Education for All became law. Members from every tribe represented in Montana came together and developed this list of important concepts that provide a focus to understanding more about each unique culture represented in Montana. A few years ago, after consideration of teacher feedback, we took the opportunity to revise the original document and expand each understanding in order to make them much more accessible for teachers and students. However, each of the understandings is so packed full with knowledge, information, stories, and perspectives. We hope that this series has filled in some of the gaps for you. I would now like to introduce our presenters, Miranda Murray and Jordan Langford Forster. Jordan, also named Bright Trail Woman, is Ani and Anishinaabe, and Miranda is a descendant of the Yankton Sioux tribe of Fort Peck. Jordan and Miranda are both Indian Education for All instructional coaches in their school district. They are also lead facilitators of Bright Trail Education, an education consulting company that provides culturally competent education strategies, equity training, and dropout prevention plans that serve American Indian communities. Both facilitators have presented nationwide in their efforts to spread awareness and support concerning Indian Education for All and equity in the classroom. And I would just like to say they've done a phenomenal job this series. So hang on to your seats and enjoy our final in this series.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very kind. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the final installment of our Essential Understandings for the webinar series. Again, my name is Miranda Murray, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of the things we have to talk about today.
Hi, I'm Jordan Langford Forster, Bright Trail Woman. Yeah, as Jennifer was explaining, the 7 essential understandings are great. However, sometimes it's a little bit difficult when we look at them in their entirety. How do we incorporate those into our classrooms? How do we make sure that our students are understanding these concepts? So we developed this webinar series just to help fellow educators and also people in whatever capacity or space they're in to develop ways that they can naturally infuse these concepts into their curriculum in a way that makes sense for grade level. So hopefully we are helpful to you in that aspect. And we will get started. What we are going to do first, though, is we want to acknowledge what today is. And today is National Day. It's technically National Awareness Day of missing women and girls, missing Indigenous women and girls. But we as a community still are calling it MMIP because we don't want to leave the males out of this crisis and what's happening to them as well. And actually men are far more underreported than women. But just to give you some statistics, we got this off of the nativewomenwilderness.org. And it says our women and girls are being taken from us in an alarming way. As of 2016, the National Crime Information Center has reported 5,712 cases of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. Strikingly, the U.S. Department of Justice Missing Persons Database has only reported 116 cases. The majority of these murders are committed by non-Native people on Native-owned land. The lack of communication combined with jurisdictional issues between state, local, and tribal law enforcement make it nearly impossible to begin the investigative process. And some statistics concerning that is that Indigenous women and girls are murdered at a 10 times higher rate than all other ethnicities. Murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women, according to the Centers for Disease Control. And so when we think of that in terms of just, I guess, quality of life, when we think of all of the things that potentially can harm our health, cancer, other diseases, it's really alarming to understand that murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women and girls. What you're seeing on your screen right now is a community awareness project that we put on today. So it's over 300 red dresses. Red dresses are the symbol for MMIP. And we put up over 300 dresses on a fence on a local one-way here in Great Falls. So drivers could see. I think that it's very common in our community still. People are unaware of how big of an issue this is, and not just today. It's been an issue for over 500 years, but also the missing part of this MMIP story is interwoven with human trafficking. And so we just wanted to bring awareness to MMIP and also human trafficking in our community. As I said, a lot of folks are unaware of what an issue human trafficking is, because they think of human trafficking victims as people who are, stolen and kept in cages or something. But human trafficking is easily undetected in communities. And I haven't read a criminal handbook recently, but also when you are committing a crime, you try not to make it very obvious, thus getting away with the crime. And so human trafficking is one of those things that's really under detected, not easily seen in communities. And it's really important to educate, especially our children, on this issue. And if you're working with those younger kiddos or younger grade levels, it doesn't have to be a conversation around murder. That's very abrasive and discombobulating for younger students, but it could be a conversation of, don't talk to strangers. Don't send pictures to anyone over your phone when you are going from your house to auntie's house or grandma's house. Make sure that you call and check in and let someone know that you made it there safely. Just conversations around that are very important with our youth.
So with that, we're going to dive right into sovereignty. We have a lot to cover in our class today. And so your first, we're going to keep going with our normal circumstances here, where we are going to read through the essential understanding. So essential understanding number 7 reads, American Indian tribal nations are inherent sovereign nations, and they possess sovereign powers, separate and independent from the federal and state governments. However, under the American legal system, the extent and breadth of self-governing powers are not the same for each tribe. So we are going to start a Menti. I will stop my screen share. I will also go ahead and copy and paste the essential understanding into the chat so that you can pick out those words that stand out to you as being important aspects of this essential understanding.
So words or word phrases, just a way to simplify, or maybe a starting place that you can begin explaining this concept to your classroom or whoever it is you are communicating with.
So if you are new, you'll go to www.menti.com and you'll use the code 2304-3523 to put in what words do you notice about essential understanding number 7? If you cannot open a new tab on your device, you are welcome to put the word that you notice in the chat as well. This is free software, by the way, so it's really fun for live presentations. Obviously, this is in real time, so you're seeing the words that are biggest. Most of you are answering with the bigger words, and the smaller words are less people are answering with those same words. So when we get done here, I will save this, and this word cloud will be available in the participant resource folder.
As people are getting a chance to enter the phrases they'd like to put in there, I forgot to mention two things. One, if you look in your participation folder, there is some articles for further reading. We will mention those throughout the night. One of the articles that goes along with learning more about MMIP and MMIW is a really great article connecting the pipelines and oil fields to sexual violence and human trafficking, and specifically to reservation areas, MMIP people. So if that is of interest to you to learn more, it is a good article, and you can find that in your participation folder.
Couple more moments for folks to respond on Menti. If you have more than one answer, you can input your answer, or up to 3 answers is what you can input per person.
Another way to do this with students is to ask them to point out words that maybe they don't know or phrases they don't understand. And then you can really kind of go from there as a starting point to give your students background information before diving into the essential understanding. Right.
So we saw sovereign as the most responded to, self-governing, inherent, not the same, independent, nation. And again, if you are beginning to introduce this concept to your students, I always recommend either creating flashcards with these vocabulary phrases on them, or you can do a word wall that you revisit throughout the year. So you're just touching base if you have a little bit of extra time in class, or maybe some downtime or inside recess, you can review the word wall. I just said out loud, if you have indoor recess, you can, I'm sure the kids would love to do that during recess time. Maybe not that, but I mean, just thinking out loud, if you're looking for another activity.
Quiet time activity.
Oh man,
That's funny.
what a lame teacher I am.
When you're thinking about the essential understanding, sometimes, and I hope that we can address some of these topics for you today, and especially if you're able to join us for the deeper dive, we will be able to address some of these concerns. Sometimes when people read this essential understanding, they get very freaked out about how they're going to share this with younger kids, because sovereignty is very much an idea and a concept that I think a lot of adults struggle with, let alone our students. And so we'll be talking about different ways to utilize this information and talk about it with kids. And in our deeper dive, we'll be looking at that for more lesson plan oriented discussions, but it can be kind of an overwhelming topic. I think I'm really only recently getting the hang of spelling sovereignty. I spell it wrong on a regular basis. So we are always trying to demonstrate to kids that it's okay.
We understand the concept.
Yeah, for sure. Can't spell it.
I walked into my Miranda sub for me one day, and she was going through the 7 essential understandings with my students, and she very much was trying to help them spell it. in a way that she believed would be helpful for them, and she still spelled it wrong. It was very funny for me, but
The kids
anyway,
thought it was
but
great.
they understand the concept. That's what's
Yeah.
important. That's what's important.
For sure.
So with that, we are going to invite you to please, Miranda's going to also put this link in the chat. Please visit this YouTube page and watch this video clip of George W. Bush describing what tribal sovereignty means to him. And when you come back, just please let us know in the chat that you're back and we will discuss this. So just pay attention to his definition of sovereignty, maybe his understanding of sovereignty, and then we will talk about that when everyone returns from watching this short video clip. Is it in the chat? Yep. Excellent. You will find the video clip link in the chat. We'll give a couple more moments for folks to return.
You guys just gave us a great laugh when we saw your responses as you were returning.
Great. So in the chat, now that folks are returning, thank you so much for letting us know that you're back with us. Please articulate what sovereignty means, or perhaps what sovereignty meant to President Bush. So what emotions did he convey while answering that question? Was there a clear definition that was given? Was there, I guess, clarification or acknowledgement to tribal sovereignty? So some confusion, it looks like. He did a great job of using the word, yes, absolutely. He repeated it several times. Right. So the reason that we shared this with you is not to bash him or put him on the spot by any means. We're going to start unpacking this concept of sovereignty. And in his defense, he is confused with good reason, because sovereignty does not look the same for everybody. I do wish that he could have at least defined it a little bit
sort
more.
of definition. As teachers, we're definitely frustrated with, we don't allow students to use the word in the definition.
Right.
So that's
and
something as teachers we get a lot.
So we'll definitely cover why there's some confusion, but you know, it's really hard. It's a really hard concept to tackle and understand, and especially when it's made very clear that people who are directly involved in the goings on of tribal sovereignty really can't pinpoint the definition themselves. So again, it's not meant to personally attack him, right? I mean,
it's also definitely a little bit on purpose in certain circumstances, that it's a kind of a wishy-washy definition depending on where it's coming from, because you know, we're always thinking critically when we're reading. We can think about critically when we're watching things. Who does it benefit if it's not clear exactly what we can outline as sovereign or sovereign rights and those things? It definitely benefits the government to have that be kind of a wishy-washy idea, which has contributed to a lot of confusion for lawmakers and people that need to understand or need to have a clear definition of what this means.
Absolutely, especially when you're dealing with over 700 federally recognized tribes themselves in different locations. The former president might only have some concept or idea of what tribal sovereignty looks like in his area or what he's been exposed to as well. And that's really
Which
hard,
could be very limited.
really hard. Well, it looks a little limited, a wee bit limited, but it's really your worldview too and what you've experienced. And so sovereignty for tribes over on the East Coast looks far different than Plains tribes or tribes on the West Coast. And we're going to talk about that, but we just wanted to share that clip with you and let everybody know that if that's also how you feel, if you were asked the same question and that was your answer, hopefully we can be helpful tonight and start to unpack this concept and this idea. So we have the definition via dictionary.com. Please, we're going to give you a couple of moments to read through this, and please respond in the chat. What does sovereignty convey about power? What does this definition of sovereignty convey about power? What does this definition of sovereignty convey about power? Also, we've included how to spell it. Yeah. Well, the power. Absolutely. So power is power. If you are sovereign, that means that you have a lot of power. Absolutely. If you're wondering how I explain sovereignty to my students or how I define it for them, is I say sovereignty is your ability to be separate and independent.
And those words are something that kids of most ages understand, even if they don't understand what that means in terms of a government or a tribal entity. They can understand independence and they can understand being separate from something.
Oh, sorry, Mike. I said that backwards. 574 recognized tribes. I apologize.
Oh,
Sometimes I get a little
flip
worked
the
up.
numbers in your head.
That's fine. I apologize.
We get excited.
But if you added in all of the unrecognized tribes, then it would be
for sure
plus 700. Okay, so if you are nervous as well about implementing Essential Understanding 7 and sovereignty, one of the cool things about it, well, it is reflected in all of the essential understandings, but also it's important to kind of defer to Essential Understanding 5, dealing with federal policy. So we're just going to reflect on this timeline for just a moment and discuss how federal policy has affected tribal sovereignty. So when we look at this timeline, it's important to remember that federal policies conflicted with each other. They were overlapping. A lot of them in many ways are still continuing today. And so that's going to affect your nation's ability to be separate and independent when you had these federal laws that really hindered your ability to operate in a separate and independent fashion, especially when we look at termination ending in the mid-70s and self-determination not beginning until then. I know for students, it seems like the 70s were a long time ago, right? It really wasn't if you're thinking it as it in terms of developing a strong community and a strong nation, when it wasn't until the mid-70s that tribal nations had the ability to gain more power and begin making decisions for themselves and behalf of their people. When you think about it in the terms of the United States, I always say that the United States has had since 1776 to get it together, right? To make a plan, to make a direction, to keep evolving and changing over time. And so comparatively, when you look at tribal sovereignty, and again, that ability to be separate and independent, it's going to take some time to build a strong community, a strong foundation in a way that relates to contemporary times.
I think a good practice to get into with your students as you are constantly looking at different current events, different topics, is to remind yourself or ask yourself, does this help or hurt sovereignty? And I think over time, that can help build your students' understanding of what sovereignty is. So if you were reflecting even just on this timeline, you could go through and talk about some of the different the highlights or the different major points of each era and say, does this help or hurt tribal sovereignty? And really kind of ground your students in that understanding of being able to kind of quickly reflect on that just throughout time. That doesn't have to be its own separate thing. That can just be a quick question that you're asking as you come across topics that it's appropriate to tie it to. So now we have a poll that's about to come up on your screen.
Quick reminder, the poll is anonymous. Answer to the best of your ability, but don't be freaked out that anyone's going to know how you answered. So our poll question, you took a breath like you were going to read it.
I can, okay, go ahead. Do you want to read it?
Sure. What affects the nation's ability to remain sovereign the most? So what affects a nation's ability to remain separate and independent? Is it a nation's location and access to resources, a nation's ability to evolve and change over time? The people of the nation are committed to success, or a nation's ability to interact with other nations in a contemporary setting. Couple more moments for folks to respond. What affects a nation's ability to remain sovereign the most? All right. So it looks like the majority of answers were a nation's location and access to resources. Great. Well, that was one of our trick questions, because all of those components rely on each other equally for sustainable sovereignty. We're going to explain that here in a moment, but it's very important to have all of these things in your ability to remain separate and independent. So all of these things affect sovereignty. So when we're looking at a nation's location and access to resources, that's going to affect your infrastructure, also your economic flow, depending on where your community is located, right? And we see that all the time in Montana, the difference between an urban city in Montana or a small town. That's going to affect your ability to remain separate and independent. The ability to change or evolve over time means that you are moving forward with the development of those resources in whatever way makes sense to your community, whatever way makes sense to your nation. The commitment to success means, although there's, factionalism, you recognize the first two components of this and you keep future generations in mind while with consistency and direction. So a nation's access to resources and their location, also your commitment to success and your ability to evolve and change over time with those two first things in mind. And then also interacting with other nations in a contemporary setting. It involves the acknowledgement of the first three while distributing equal power amongst them. So, if you are located in a place, not even thinking of necessarily resources, but what you have access to. So internet or broadband, that's going to affect your success. It's going to affect your ability to evolve and change over time and also interact with other government systems. So I'm especially thinking in this time of COVID and these Zoom meetings that everybody's having, it's going to be really difficult to communicate with outside entities if you don't have something like internet access.
Yeah, we've definitely seen some of these different components be tested during this time. It's obviously something that is ongoing because of ongoing laws and interactions. But it's interesting to see how as contemporary issues arise and change, it's an ebb and flow. It's constantly affecting the different aspects of sovereignty.
Absolutely. And here in Montana, no tribal land is the same, right? You have different resources, you have different access to things. So like Flathead has access to timber, development of water projects, and they have access to a lot of recreation, which means that they are open more to tourism in comparison to somewhere like Rocky Boys, right? We have the Flathead that's obviously located on Flathead Lake, and one of Montana's big economic pieces, especially in the summertime, is that tourism. Blackfeet has access to some oil, and I don't mean this when I talk about resources, I don't mean it in a way that tribes need to be utilizing them in this way. I'm just trying to articulate how their land base differs from each other. So I don't mean it in a way that I'm saying I'm coming from a place of authority and saying tribes should be using these resources. I'm just trying to articulate how they differ. So Blackfeet has some access to oil. Crow and Northern Cheyenne, it's kind of the same with coal and oil, Fort Peck oil, but Belknap and Rocky Boys, they don't have a lot of natural resources. And so that ability to create a strong infrastructure or economic flow is going to look differently. And, there's differences in economic opportunity, and it may not be in your best interest to develop your land in a permanent fashion. And the development of resources, it opens the door for outside manipulation and influence as well. And that's really the component of the depth and breadth of sovereignty looks different for all tribal nations, and it looks different across the state too. So when we're thinking about economic development, because we operate on the federalist system, it's up to the states to decide things like gambling and whether that's legal in your state or not. So you get those states like Arizona and Washington and Oregon and others that gambling's illegal in the state, but because reservation land or tribal land is considered federal land, people go and visit those casinos. They make entire trips or vacations out of visiting those places because they can't access those things anywhere else. Where in Montana, you can drive any direction and in about 30 seconds, you will stumble upon a casino, right? And so it's always going to be looking different just based on your location and your access to resources. And also too, how I explain that to students and other educators is the people of the nation are committed to success. And when you think of that in an individual perspective, success is going to look differently to everyone. So would you be totally comfortable with entering in a business venture with everyone in your community or everyone in your town or city? That means that everybody's going to have to be on the same page with the same goals and the same commitment levels. That's a really risky thing to do. And it's really hard to
achieve.
Absolutely. When you're just thinking of individual perspective and how success looks different to each individual as well. So we've talked about this in some of our past webinars. Miranda, I believe, puts this article also in your resource, but a great way to talk about sovereignty with your students as well is we have a lot of information coming out because it's been happening more and more frequently, is this idea of bison restoration. So there is a bison restoration short article in your resource folder, and folks ask, well, what does bison restoration have to do with sovereignty? And it's really a concept around food sovereignty, the ability to remain separate and independent and build that strong community, that strong nation. And that a big piece of that is the people's ability to feed themselves, to take care of themselves, to restore those bison back to their communities so that they have access to food sources and less reliance on outside entities and outside manipulation. It was something that definitely happened during federal Indian policy when we saw the destruction of the bison on the Great Plains. And then during the treaty era, where you get the federal government saying, well, if you cede this land, we'll do things like subsidize your food income. But that affected sovereignty because it strengthened the reliance on the federal government to provide food to their communities. And so we're personally proponents of food sovereignty, and that for us means the restoration of bison.
Yeah, some of the other things that you can talk about with food sovereignty, which we'll get into in our deeper dive next week, is also thinking about the components of taking back that independent control over traditional foods. We often have conversations with some of our part of our food culinary aspect of school, and talking about what makes traditional food and being able to restore those traditional foods and how that ties into sovereignty as well. Again, that article for further reading is in your participation folder. I'm going to share on the screen just so you can have some imagery here to see the title. So Great Falls Tribune does a newsletter called 8 Nations. If you go to the Tribune, you can just sign up for this newsletter. It is free. It comes out every Friday, and it's a newsletter on Indigenous topics. And so this article particularly, it's in your participants look here folder, aptly named, and so you can find that, and it is an article on Ben Pease, a Crow artist. And the thing that I think is important to talk about with art, and I can't keep a lot of stuff on the screen because you have to have rights for artwork, but I think the interesting thing about Native art that's been really a topic of conversation having to do with being independent and separate, and this idea of maintaining your self-identity and being able to make a living has to do with quote unquote Native artists. And so this article does a great job talking about how many artists are struggling walking this line of being referred to as Native artists. And so the title of that article is, "Why Can't I Just Be an Artist?" Because you rarely introduce other artists by their ethnicity. And so
that's true.
Yeah, and he says that in the article. He says you would never say so-and-so, a white artist, because it's not a part of the conversation necessarily. It'll come up in biography and further reading having to do with that artist when you're learning more about background. But when you are dealing with Indigenous artists, it starts with that phrasing, and it's the leading part of the conversation. And the reason not all artists are bothered by this, obviously, we know that all people are independent of each other and diverse and unique. But one of the problems that comes with this is being able to branch out into any kind of artwork that they want to make. Because a lot of times when artists are labeled with this Native or Indigenous perspective, then they're expected to kind of be using those ideas and those images and really being pigeonholed into a certain kind of art.
Again, it's that romanticizing idea of what Native art should look like. And then, you know, also you get the appropriation of people wanting to try to copy that. And I was like, that's so true. Like, I haven't read the article. I don't know why I responded that way, but just you saying that, I was like, yeah. And it's really important too, when we're thinking about sovereignty, is allowing people to earn a living and make a living. And so much of that was lost during the reservation period. You consolidated groups of people on specific tracts of land just in one area. And what does that mean for their future? What does that mean for the next day? If I don't have the ability to live traditionally, if I don't have the ability or, you know, providing for my family, what does that look like? As when the federal government began implementing things like this and really strengthening Native people's reliance on the federal government, it's a form of control, but also, you know, what does that look like for Native people, especially now in this era of self-determination? If we want to regain sovereignty, a big piece of that too is allowing Indigenous people to make a living in a contemporary way, in a contemporary setting.
Yeah, if you go and if you read this article, it's also a really interesting, very new and contemporary concept. Ben Pease is starting to dip into NFT artwork, which is non-fungible. It's digital artwork that you don't have. So you pay for it and it's permanent and it has a piece of code that goes with it, and it can never be erased. It can never go away. It can never be degraded over time by fading or dirt or anything. But it's kind of the same idea of like digital currency in the stock market. It's this very new concept. And so it's a really cool thing to see. I don't know enough about it to know whether it's a good or bad thing. It's just an interesting thing. But it's very cool, and I think a great way to tie into sovereignty, this contemporary aspect of artists being able to contribute to sovereignty for identity purposes and making a living and having this, regaining this self-control, and being some of the first people to step into this new, you know, we talk about evolving and changing over time, and that sovereignty, that's a big part of it. And so this kind of ties right into that. So very interesting concept if that's something that you're interested in learning more about.
Absolutely. Did you say fungible?
Yeah, it's a
I'm
interesting
certain,
word.
I'm certain that's not a word.
I think it is.
I'm certain that's not a word.
Oh, I saw someone put in the chat. I will look into that. I just got a newsletter. I just got the last Friday one, so I'm certain it's still a thing. So what I will do when I am done here is go into my email and get the link, and I'll put it in the participation folder. I'm wondering, I don't know why that was something that you couldn't get to. I hope only after a couple of issues it didn't go away, because I was just sharing this resource with Jordan a couple weeks ago, and I was like, this is really great. We have an Indigenous writer here in Great Falls, or a writer who writes on Indigenous topics, and she really focuses on making sure Indigenous perspectives are included in our news here in Great Falls for the Tribune. And so this newsletter is a great resource. So I hope it's continuing. So I will look into that and get the link available to you guys so that if you are interested in signing up for it, that you can.
Okay, this is just a different way to look at that federal Indian policy timeline. And when we are looking at material, not all material is great, but material can also be used as a teaching tool. So it's just really important to reflect on our timeline here and really examine the constant change in the dealings with American Indian people and the powers that they were able to exert. So when we look at things like time immemorial, if you're worried about how am I going to implement sovereignty into my class, this is a great way to do it as well. So when you're looking at time immemorial, just a brief summary here in the center column of what was going on. And I don't mean to say brief as in a way to gloss over it, but it's really important to also look at these federal policies in terms of how, in that third column, how did they affect tribal sovereignty and how do they still affect tribal sovereignty? So when we're looking at time immemorial, living in this way of self-sufficiency and operating independently, but then colonization comes along. We're going to talk about the doctrine of discovery here next, but the doctrine of discovery and ways that lands were claimed and still upheld today and during the treaty period, recognizing tribal governments as separate entities. So in many ways, the treaty period actually strengthens tribal sovereignty because we have these primary source documents that we can go back to and tribes say, I was here. I've been an entity since time immemorial. Assimilation, we're going to look at the Marshall Trilogy a little bit later, but assimilation when tribal nations were deemed wards, paternalism was very heavy and land was held in trust. Reorganization, requiring tribal governments to be modeled after the United States. So reorganization, it did give small forms of control back to tribes, but if you really look at reorganization, the federal government was basically saying, well, we're going to give you some power, but this power needs to be modeled after the United States, after the framework of the United States. And then termination, how did that affect tribal sovereignty? So then out of nowhere, they decide we're getting out of the Indian business. We no longer want to recognize tribes. How did that affect tribal sovereignty? It wasn't until self-determination that tribes are beginning to gain independence and civil rights, just like everybody else. It's also important to note that Essential Understanding 5 tells us that through federal policy, American Indian people have been the most regulated people in the history of the United States. And all of these things really affect sovereignty even today.
Like Jordan said, the discovery doctrine is a really important piece of talking about and explaining kind of back to that connection that we were talking about earlier, like who does it benefit for this to be kind of wishy-washy and back and forth. As you saw demonstrated in that chart that we just had up about the timeline, it very much goes back and forth as to whether tribes are granted sovereignty based on the laws that are in place or the time period that we're talking about. But the discovery doctrine is an important piece of this because
this isn't actually the discovery doctrine.
No. This is our
simplified version,
easy version to understand.
Absolutely.
You can certainly look for in some of those resources we shared in past webinars, you can find the actual discovery doctrine and look at that as a primary source document. But this is kind of a pared down version. We've briefly mentioned the discovery doctrine in past webinars, especially with federal policy, but I wanted to kind of go over the different parts of this really quickly to be able to see just how sovereignty is addressed and then at the same time not addressed. So there are several sections to the discovery doctrine, and this document gave explorers the right to claim land based on certain circumstances. Obviously based on circumstances that would be beneficial to the explorers, not to acknowledge or care really that there were other people and other occupants on the land, but to take the land for themselves. So these sections going as follows. So the first discovery means I get there, I find it, it's mine. Just no questions asked, it's mine. And so that's kind of when we talk about it with kids, I kind of say like finders keepers. That's an easy concept for them to understand at many ages. And so this is obviously not acknowledging sovereignty because it was not acknowledging anybody's presence or use of the land.
Absolutely. And just because the land wasn't necessarily occupied at that time doesn't mean that it wasn't used seasonally and specifically by tribes. Just because you get there and you don't see anybody doesn't mean that you gain immediate ownership. That would be like someone walking into your house while you're at work or at Walmart, I don't know, and being like, oh, no one's here, mine.
That would be a scary concept. But according to this document, that would be something you could do. Even if you see signs of or signs of other presences or signs of other ownership, you can keep it. So we're not acknowledging sovereignty here. Then we have this second section called actual occupancy and current possession. And this means, okay, now you've said finders keepers, you can keep it, but you need to build a settlement here so that we can really say this is ours. And your settlement must have soldiers to demonstrate at all times that this land is being used as yours and therefore nobody else's. So we're still not acknowledging any sovereignty here.
Which is also interesting too, because during this time, everyone could be considered a soldier, right?
Yep. Then we have preemption European title. This means that the discoverer, whatever country they hail from, has the sole right to buy the land from the native population. So wait a second here. If they can show up and take it and they can claim it as theirs, but they also have the right to buy it from the native population, that idea inherently recognizes that native populations were there and occupying the land and using the land. And if you can buy it from someone, that recognizes them as an independent, separate person from you. Because if they're not independent and separate from you, you don't have to buy the land from them. So this is kind of that wishy-washy area where we're saying it's ours, we get to keep it, you're not using it. But if you want to sell it, I get the right to sell it or to buy it first because I am the discoverer. So a little bit of acknowledgement of sovereignty. Then we have Indian title. This is the section that says that Native people can occupy the land, but they can't own the land unless they'd like to sell it. So again, kind of a wishy-washy acknowledgement of sovereignty, saying you're not really in charge here. I'm going to take over ownership of this land. You can be here, but you don't own the land unless you want to sell it. And if you want to sell it, as stated earlier, I'm the only one you can sell it to. So a little bit of acknowledgement of that sovereignty there. Then we have the section called Tribal Limited Sovereign and Commercial Rights. This means I'm losing some rights as a Native person, apart from all the other rights I've lost prior to this because you just came in and took over. But this means that I'm not allowed to freely trade with anyone I want. I can only trade with the discoverers of the land. And so again, not giving me separate and independent control of myself. So this is, from the very beginning, taking away that independence and control of their own selves.
Also, this Western concept of owning land or possession of land is not going to be something that's in the wheelhouse of Indigenous people, because being stewards and occupying land is different than owning land. And so this is a structure, this is a concept that is, again, not in the wheelhouse of Indigenous people. So when it's being presented to them, really, although it's held up as a legal document, I'm sure they were like, well, this is not a thing. So
yeah, doesn't matter. Nobody owns the land is kind of that thought process. And then our next section is contiguity. And this is when you're claiming the land as the discoverer, you get to have everything around it. And if there's a competing discoverer nearby, maybe I'm from Spain and I'm discovering this area, but nearby, someone from Italy is discovering that area, and halfway between we split the difference so that we are behaving like gentlemanly. Because
this is a gentleman's document.
This is a gentleman's document.
This is a gentleman's document.
And then obviously discovering the mouth of the river gives you the land next to the watershed. That's an important part. And so therefore you would want to discover, quote unquote, discover that land, or that mouth of the river. Then we have terra nullius, and this is that empty land is free game, which means more discovery claims.
Which happens to be my favorite part of this discovery doctrine, because terra nullius, this unoccupied land, was one of the starting place. It was the catalyst. This idea, this concept in the doctrine of discovery was the catalyst to the occupation of Alcatraz.
If you're familiar with the occupation of Alcatraz, the American Indian movement utilized this document as one of their legal rights and ways to occupy Alcatraz as empty land that wasn't being used. This again is not acknowledging the ways in which American Indian people lived. Just because they weren't in an area at a time doesn't mean it wasn't area of land that they used. And then we throw in there Christianity. If you are non-Christian, you don't have the same rights as us. And kind of this idea of, therefore, we need to take care of you and own the land on your behalf. Civilization means that we have a duty, kind of in connection with that Christianity, to civilize any non-Christians in the area. And then through conquest, we also can take over land through a military victory or other form of takeover, which could look like a lot of different things, as you see listed there. So the reason that this is so important is because this document over time has been upheld and used, as Jordan will talk about in a moment, but kind of somewhat acknowledging sovereignty, but very much trying to diminish and take away those independent powers.
Another piece of this story is the Marshall Trilogy. And if you're not familiar, Judge John Marshall, he was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they call it the Marshall Trilogy because there was 3 major decisions made that still are interwoven at times with tribal sovereignty. And Miranda has provided a link. We can't show you the full video, and normally we'd have you go away and watch it and come back, but it's about 16 minutes long. So we just want to recommend this video, this gentleman who is explaining the Marshall Trilogy and everything that it did and how it's affected tribal sovereignty. But I'll just give you a brief rundown. So we have
the link of this is also in your participation folder in your resources.
I'll give you a brief rundown of this. So we have Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831, and Worcester versus Georgia in 1832. And with Johnson versus McIntosh, it used the discovery doctrine, which we just went over, to establish title to the land and relinquish the capability for American Indian people to sell their land. And so that was the discovery doctrine has been upheld in the Supreme Court. And you have the Cherokee versus Georgia. The state of Georgia turned Cherokee territory into Cherokee County. So the governor decided, as a way to gain more land, that they would just turn that land into a county, which would fall under the jurisdiction of the state. And it essentially absorbed their land into the state, and it ruled that tribes are nations, and because of treaties, they are domestic and independent nations and should be treated as such, and also cannot make alliances with other governments, which obviously affects tribal sovereignty. And then in the final case, it was a case about a missionary who the state convicted of being in Indian territory without a license, and it backed plenary power in your own territory, but the state laws apply in most cases. So this is just, again, something that's very interesting to look at and still talked about and still affects sovereignty today. What you are seeing now on the screen is an abbreviated list of the governments and the goings on in Native communities. So this is an abbreviated list basically because I got sick of typing. But it's important to remember that through federal policy, especially with that Dawes Act of 1887, it opened up surplus land on reservations, and backed by the things like the Discovery Doctrine and other federal policies, it really opened the door for a level of bureaucracy that is really at times just unimaginable. So just looking at this list, I would like you to reflect and respond. I mean, really just, how well would you be able to establish your community to a strong nation when these are just some of the government agencies that you answer to? So if you look at on that federal level, we got the BIA, the Department of Housing, Department of Labor, Bureau of Land Management, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, because you're developing resources and all of those things on your land. The state or local level, we got Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Department of Health, Department of Social Rehabilitation, State of Education. So everything that we answer to in an urban setting as far as education, tribal communities have to do the same as far as OPI and reporting to the state. Yeah, so Nate commented that there's not a lot of sovereignty when you're answering to these things. And so these are all government agencies that require reports. They require annual updates. Even with our grant in our district, that treaty documents have promised Indigenous communities as far as supplementing education and things like that. Every year we write a grant to be able to maintain the allocation of that funding, and it takes several months. I believe our director said that it's about 200 pages.
He's been working on it a long time, and it's very frustrating because, like Jordan said, it's guaranteed via treaties, this funding that's supposed to be allocated. But as you've noted in the chat, that the federal government really does like its paperwork and bureaucracy,
which is funny because they're not so great about keeping track of it. Sorry.
And
I'm not sorry. Keep going.
It's true. And so it's frustrating because it's very patronizing to have something be guaranteed to you via treaty, but also you have to apply for it. And if you don't do it right, we're not going to give it to you for now, even though it's guaranteed to you. So it's very interesting to think about how tribal nations are supposed to be able to work within this system that is not an easy system to work within.
Yeah. So when we're looking at tribal governments, we have federal government, state and local, and then tribal. What makes the state and local, what makes all of these levels of government difficult is that the boundaries of reservations sometimes involve several counties. So you get that overlapping of jurisdiction and land within the reservation. You have factions of land within reservation boundaries that are non-native owned. We have privatized land, and tribes cannot operate civil jurisdiction on non-native issues. So again, you got that Fish, Wildlife and Parks, that affects hunting, the Department of Health, the policies and statewide programs, Department of Social and Rehabilitation, that contracts services with tribes. So adding another level of bureaucracy, the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, so that deals with water and land rights on reservations. And it makes all of these things, so if you look at that federal and that state and local level, it really makes it difficult for tribes when they're dealing with all of these things to say, okay, now what are we going to do? How are we going to move forward? The Bureau of Indian Affairs, it's obviously important, but they have a regular presence on reservations. They oversee law enforcement, economic development, financial administration, constitutional reform, and then so on and so forth. And tribal governments within themselves also deal with a significant amount of factionalism. And that's that idea of, is everybody on the same page and wanting to go in the same direction because of individual beliefs? You know, it's similar to what we see to the US today. We can't make blanket statements or assume that one racial group believes the same things and wants to move in the same directions. That's just not the case. And factionalism also comes from the fact that more than one tribe often is located on reservations, and they have different ideas, they have different practices within those tribes on reservations. You have special committees and council hearings, and we're asking people at the end of the day, when we look at tribal governments and we get questions Like, why can't they get it together? Why can't they get their community together? We're literally asking American Indian people to participate in a political system that has historically betrayed them. Right?
Also jump through 3 rings of fire while juggling batons. Like, it's just unrealistic, the standards and amount of pieces and moving wheels involved in these processes.
Yeah, when we're talking about the differences among tribes too. So the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, 5 reservations accepted it, 2 reservations did not. So the Crow and Fort Peck continued to operate council governments outside of the Reorganization Act. So then that adds on a different layer when we're talking about the depth and breadth, is that tribes have different relationships with the federal government as well. And the good news here is that tribal governments, in our experience, reservation governments, they're highly involved in the goings on of their community and the community needs, because they're right there in that area, right? They're local, they're in the community. And most of their employees are American Indian people themselves. But it's just really important to reflect on those US Supreme Court decisions that upheld trust relationships and this whole concept of paternalism between the United States and tribes.
A lot to digest there, but really important information to understand. I know that this one, in terms of like the amount of information to understand, is kind of similar to federal policy, because federal policy is involved. And so I hope that you're finding this information helpful. It is a lot to listen to, and it's very much, still indicative of what we're saying. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of parts involved that make it hard for tribes.
Yeah, and so the extent and breadth of self-governing powers is not the same for every tribe. That's not just specific to Montana. That applies to tribes all across the United States, all 574 federally recognized tribes. And also, it's affected by those 4 components that we discussed earlier: the location, access to resource, commitment to success. Everybody's on the same page. You're able to also work with other nations in a contemporary setting. All of those things are really important to remember when we're looking at things like sovereignty and, what's going on, because it's a frustrating part for us when we're having discussions, especially with other educators, when they ask us, well, it doesn't seem like tribes have their stuff together. It doesn't seem like, this is anything that they even really want to do. And that's not the case. It's really important, again, to examine those federal policies and how a lot of their consequences are still alive today when we are examining the ability to be separate and independent.
So with all of that information in mind, we have a scenario for you to respond to in the chat. So the scenario says, your parents have agreed to let you move out of the house into your own home under the following conditions. You work at a job of their choosing. You stay in the same town that they are currently living in. Your home will be subject to inspections by them. That feels realistic. I feel like my parents inspect.
Yeah. My mom's really judgy. I feel that every time she comes over. She's like, "Is your bathroom clean?"
Yeah. If you have family and children, your house rules must reflect those that you were subjected to growing up. And they have access to your bank account and can evaluate how you're spending your money. And your house will be in your parents' name, and they will retain the title to the house.
So please reflect and respond in the chat. How would you feel? And also, how is your sovereignty and autonomy affected by this policy under these conditions? How would you feel? And how is your sovereignty and autonomy affected under these conditions? Seen some great responses so far. A couple more moments to reflect and respond in the chat.
Appreciate all your participation.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. The fact of the matter is, this scenario, particularly these conditions, are very similar to historical federal Indian policies. So these things have been implemented on American Indian people. So you work at a job of your parents' choosing. That's what farming was during the reservation and assimilation period. That's what the boarding schools did, is they trained American Indian students to do very specific jobs. It wasn't necessarily doctors or lawyers. It was what we would probably consider more remedial jobs, blacksmiths, maids, house cleaners. You stay in the same town as they are currently living. That's what the BIA is on reservations. Your home, again, will be subject to inspections by them. So when we were looking at that list of government agencies operating on reservations, those are the agencies that tribal nations have to report to. If you have a family and children, your house rules must be applied to the rules that you are subjected to. And this idea of paternalism, they have access to your bank account and can evaluate how you are spending your money. That's what an IAM account was. That's what an individual Indian money account was during the assimilation era. That was what Eloise Cobell sued over for her class action lawsuit, was the mismanagement of IAM accounts. And then your house will be in your parents' name and they will retain the title to it. That's what land held in trust means, is that the federal government holds that land and title of that space.
I liked the response about that Nate shared, that he would hate it for himself, but he would like it for his kids. But like, that's literally the feeling is, I've seen people respond to this before and say, well, what's the point of even moving out then? I might as well live at home and be cheaper in this particular scenario. And really that idea of your of the government being paternalistic over you is really, do you have sovereignty then? And that sense of hurting sovereignty and or effectively taking sovereignty away.
Absolutely. And so our nations here, our American Indian nations, are sovereign nations, but what that looks like is going to be different. And again, it's going to take a little bit of time to establish strong sovereignty, and it doesn't look the same for everybody, depending on those 4 components that we discussed earlier. Thank you for playing with us. We love the scenarios.
We have fun with
We have a lot of fun with the scenarios. All right, here's the good news. Here's the good news. It's easy to get trapped in Essential Understanding 7 and say, I don't know how I'm going to articulate sovereignty to my students. I don't know how I'm going to convey this idea and how to have this conversation with them. But the great news is that if you are addressing Essential Understanding 1 through 6 in your classroom, those solidify this concept of sovereignty. So if you are discussing diversity among tribes, you are reinforcing sovereignty. If you are discussing diversity among individuals, you are reinforcing sovereignty and autonomy. If you are teaching that culture is alive and well, that is articulating sovereignty and tribal nations' ability to continue to practice their inherent traditions and cultural aspects. Reservation land was reserved by tribes for tribes. That's sovereignty. You cannot make an illegal agreement. You cannot sign a treaty with a nation that you don't recognize. You're recognizing that nation. That solidifies sovereignty. Federal Indian policies throughout history have been infringed, but also revisiting that chart that we showed a little bit earlier and also discussing how some of these policies strengthen tribal sovereignty. And then 6, the inclusion of multiple perspectives is always important. That strengthens sovereignty because it allows students and whoever it is that you're communicating with to understand that individual American Indians and also nations have a voice, they have a perspective, they have a history, they have a government that's really important to understand and to become familiar with.
Yeah. So now we're, going along with this chart and moving forward here, we're going to be kind of concluding our time together tonight because we are going to be reviewing the essential understandings that we've learned together so far. And so as we're going through, I have a couple of the resources that we've mentioned and talked about just in the sidebar to really remind you about those different parts. So we'll review those. But as always, when you go back to look at your participation folder, all of these resources are linked. All of the websites we've shown, all of the books we've talked about, all of these resources that might be beneficial for you to implement this in your classroom are going to be found in your resources folder of titled Participants Look Here. So when we think about essential understanding, when we're thinking about that diversity among tribes, this has to do with resources and religion and housing and land bases, all of the things that make our different tribes in the United States different is an important factor to make sure our students understand. So when you're looking for resources that can help you talk about diversity in tribes, as much tribally specific information as you can have is the best. And that's really a good rule of thumb just in general when you're looking for resources, is anytime something says generally Native Americans or Indigenous people, you want to kind of look at it with a wary eye to see what they're saying, because our tribes in the United States are so different from each other. They're really independent nations, as we've been talking about with sovereignty. And so it's really important that we're not lumping these diverse group of people into one overarching identity. And then taking that a little bit further into essential understanding number 2, we have the diversity among the individual, really understanding that all American Indian people are different from each other. And when you're looking for resources, you're looking at different representation. We've talked about in that Fry Bread book, there's a lot of different representations of what American Indian people can look like and how they can participate in culture and how they are different from one another. Anytime you're looking for resources to help verify and solidify the idea of diversity among individuals, you can look for resources that are specific to an individual. So biographies, autobiographies, or stories about specific individuals are a great way to incorporate this understanding. And as always, essential understanding in 1 and 2 are kind of interchangeable and work together really well when you're teaching. And then we have essential understanding number 3, culture is alive and well. Thinking about all of the ways we can demonstrate contemporary American Indian people through resources and videos and websites. And if you've been joining us for our deeper dives, we've been talking about contemporary and Indigenous people each time that go along with each of the essential understandings. So that's been a really fun way to introduce essential understanding number 3 throughout our talks, because we're talking about ways that language and religion and customs and ceremonies are being practiced today and being shared in Indigenous communities, and really giving our students the opportunity to understand that that's happening all the time. I think as kind of thinking back to that video we started with, not all of the individuals of the United States are exposed to what contemporary American Indian people and culture look like and sound like. And so really making sure our students get to understand that. We're very lucky in the state of Montana to be able to have this be an essential part of our classrooms. Then we have essential understanding number 4.
Reservation
Thank
land
you.
is reserved by tribes for tribes.
I was looking at that
That's all right.
document
That's
and
why
I
I'm
was
here.
like,
It's all right.
federal? No. So talking about reservation systems and how reservations and land-based, there's a lot of different ways to focus on this essential understanding. It's really important to teach about and understand reservations, how they came to be, how they are different. You can layer on those essential understandings in diversity and talking about how reservations are different because of how they came to be and where they are located. But you can also really focus less on the government side of reservations and more on the land base and the importance to place that many tribes in our area have, and be able to kind of talk about traditional lands and the lands that our reservations are on today. When we're looking through essential understanding number 5, we're talking about the federal policy and all of those timelines that we've looked at throughout some of the series, and looking at how those overlap and really making sure that you're getting the opportunity to talk about those different eras. Again, when you're looking at those different eras, not trying to think about teaching them all at the same time, but incorporating them throughout, just the same as your essential understandings, because you can layer these all together. They really do overlap. So there's a lot of different resources that can help you teach these different eras and time periods that are relevant to a lot of different age levels. Essential understanding number 6, talking about how history can often be conflicting depending on who has the opportunity to tell the story. And so we're looking for firsthand accounts and Indigenous perspectives when we're talking about history. And so anytime you can provide multiple accounts and views and perspectives on historical events and information, you're not only teaching essential understanding number 6, but you're benefiting your children in your classroom, because you're giving them a more whole truth as to what they're understanding about the past. And then essential understanding number 7, that we've been talking about, that sovereignty. I really like to include the tribal flags as a visual representation of sovereignty, because I think giving students the understanding, students recognize flags as being something that different groups have. So states have flags, and the United States has a flag. And so having tribal nations flags represented really does kind of help reinforce that idea of separate and independent, and having its own place in our system. One of the books that we've mentioned, I think, in our deeper dives, but I didn't get to mention and here tonight, is called The People Shall Continue. And so I've featured this in our deeper dives. This is an excellent book to teach about all the essential understandings and all of the timelines, because the way that this is written, and there's different, if you go to look for this, there's different covers when you're looking on Amazon, for example, if that's where you're going to look for it. So don't worry if you don't see this exact cover, but each section, each page, section of pages covers a different time period, therefore also covering different essential understandings, and is written in a really beautiful way. It's repetitive and rhythmic and kind of poetic in the way that it's written, and it's written from an Indigenous perspective on all of these different parts of history. It's illustrated well. It is something that you could break up. It's definitely not just because it's like in picture book format. It has some complex ideas in there. It's definitely something you could take the writing from and use with older kids to really dive into understanding what those time periods mean, and what those essential understandings that relate to those time periods mean. There are a lot of books out there also that you can use, like this one, Documents of United States Indian Policy, or thinking about Indigenous perspectives in terms of self-control and being able to regain that independence, like we've been talking about tonight. So lots of complex resources out there because it's a complex subject, but that the people shall continue can really be utilized for all elementary, middle school, and high school grades. So as we conclude tonight, I would just ask that in the chat you ask any questions that might be lingering. Hopefully you can join us for our deeper dive next week. And if you could reflect in the chat, if you don't have a question, about what sovereignty could mean for you in your classroom. How might you integrate sovereignty? I'm not asking for a lesson plan, just like what kind of connections are you making to your classroom and or your role in your position? Where are the flags available? Do you mean the images of the flags, Jennifer? Because I can add those images of those flags.
There's a social studies lesson. I'm not sure which grade level it's at, but it's available on the OPI website, the IFA part of the website, and it's called Tribal Flags and Seals.
Yeah, it has all of the, and it's actually a really great lesson to look at how all the flags are different and the meaning behind that. It's an art lesson. Thanks, Mike. You can look at and analyze the imagery in the seals as well. It's a really great lesson. Great question. Any of the games that you've learned in our sessions, you are welcome to use. In fact, OPI also has a traditional games unit you can find in their health and PE section that has all the written out rules, and the International Game Society in Montana works really hard to teach traditional games. That would be a great resource. They have YouTube videos also showing some of their games. They have a
I don't know what you're trying to say, but I'm trying to mentally help you, and I don't know where you're
going. I want to say demonstrations. They have classes you can sign up for, the International Game Society in the summertime. I just saw an advertisement that they're doing one in the beginning of August. I couldn't think.
I really wanted to help you and I couldn't. I was like, I have no idea what she's gonna say.
But they really are a great resource as well. But yes, anytime we want all of our kids to be able to learn those traditional games, they're really fun.
Nate, I believe that we are offering these webinars, but just the recordings of these webinars over the summer. We are available to come to your school if you would like us to do some training at your school as well, but we are also revamping the hub course as well as the webinar series for next year, so it'll look a little bit different. Mike.
I love that idea. Thank you for sharing that. You could have multiple teachers come in and give different sets of rules, but also like have them giving out consequences if students are trying to follow certain rules, but don't follow all of that. That's great. That's a great, I always enjoy anytime you can put students in a firsthand situation where they can empathize and understand really well the feelings and the ideas behind the concepts we're teaching. That's
absolutely. If you're working with older students, you could even present the scenario that we presented involving your parents and all of their rules in your new house. That's a great way to introduce information to students, just by having them put themselves in that situation and then say, how would you feel? And then say, well, actually, let's look at federal Indian policy because this is exactly what they did.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone so much for once again spending your Wednesday evening with us. We appreciate your time. We so appreciate your commitment to Indian education for all, and we really appreciate OPI for allowing us to facilitate this webinar series.
Shannon, if you, I just saw your question about utilizing Native artists and teaching about Native art. If you are able to join us for our deeper dive next week, we are going to actually go into depth about that. And if you aren't, you could,
you can email me too.
Yeah. we have lots of great resources on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for completing the first or the series 2 of the Unpacking the Essential Understandings. Maybe we'll see you next week for the final deeper dive. And then, yes, we will be releasing all of these series 2 recordings and the deeper dive recordings as a summer PD offering in case you have colleagues who are interested. We have our Indian Education for All Best Practices Conference coming up the 15th and 16th. It's free, and it's going to be a really fantastic event. So it's not too late to sign up, and we hope to see you there. So everyone, please continue having a safe and wonderful year, and we hope to see you at future professional development events in the next school year. And I hope you all have wonderful summers.